Today's training is Trauma, Parenting, and Challenging Behaviors with a focus on school-age children. And our presenter is Dr. Melissa Bernstein. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Melissa. Next slide. So today's topic explores the impact of trauma on parenting, looks at the importance of the caregiver relationship, and discusses strategies for helping caregivers identify and respond to challenging behaviors for school-age children. And Melissa is the director of the Advancing California's Trauma-Informed Systems Grant, or ACTS, as well as the Trauma-Informed Licensing Team and also referred to as TILT initiatives. Her research centers around supporting systems in planning for, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed change that aligns with best practice and science. Melissa has presented with us a number of times in the past and is definitely a dear friend of Caltrin. So we are delighted to have you back, and I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Dana. And hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all, and I'm really excited to be presenting on this topic. So just dealing with behavior problems and really challenging enough on its own, but then we add this element of trauma on top of it, and it really does make it that much more difficult. So today I'm looking forward to sharing some evidence-based approaches with you all around techniques to really work with caregivers and help to manage some challenging child behaviors. In addition to my work at Rady's, I'm also a therapist, and so the strategies that I will be sharing with you today also pull from that work as well. I'm going to use the word caregiver throughout the presentation today. Just so you all know, this really refers to really any adult that you're working with that is supporting those kiddos and families. So a biological caregiver or a resource or foster caregiver or a kinship caregiver. I will say this topic is pretty information heavy. I do provide a lot of resources and suggestions, so I really do invite you all to ask questions through the Q&A, and I'll try and engage you as much as possible in the chat as well. If I don't get to any of those questions in real time, I'll try to make sure that I leave some time at the end for that. Okay, so our agenda for our time together today, we'll talk a little bit about what happens after a trauma, talk a little bit about assessment and really that starting engagement process with caregivers, talk a lot about working with caregivers, and then go into some strategies to help shaping those difficult behaviors. Okay, so before we dive in, just want to kind of orient us. We're thinking about school-age kiddos here. So children ages 6 to 12, and the families that you work with, thinking about, what behaviors do caregivers bring to you the most? So in your work with caregivers and families, in the chat, if you could just, a couple words, one word, what are the behaviors that caregivers are really coming to you with, hey, this is a real issue for me, or this is a real problem for me, or the behaviors that you're really seeing the most that are difficult? You can throw those in the chat. So argumentative, inattentive, aggression, absolutely. So not listening, defiance, and that oppositional behavior. Siblings, so again, that aggression, defiance, all of the above, they're really coming in. Lying, tantrums, self-harm, there's just like extreme emotion. Some more extreme behaviors here, maybe stealing. Again, I definitely think we start to see those towards the end of the school age, and definitely moving into adolescence too. Defiance, aggression, lying. Okay, so we're all on the same page here. These are the behaviors that we're going to be talking about and how we address those today. When we think about, trauma and how kids respond to trauma, one thing we really know about that is each child's reaction to trauma is really unique. And so the behaviors that kids exhibit are going to really be unique as well. So we'll talk about a range of strategies that can hopefully help to kind of shape some of these behaviors. I like to think of it as this is a presentation of a toolbox. Not all of these strategies are going to help. When I'm working with caregivers, I often say, let's just try this one out, see if it works. We can do a little experiment together. And if not, let's provide another tool. So these are kind of a range of tools in our toolbox. Okay, you guys are still going. There's lots of behaviors out there. Okay. So I want to start with what may be a bit of a review for folks, but I do think it's really important to keep in mind when we're working with families, not just for ourselves, but when we're working to support caregivers. So in that registration form that you guys filled out, I saw a lot of you put one of the hardest things about dealing with challenging child behaviors in kids who have trauma is working with caregivers, and really helping them to understand what the behaviors that they're seeing are and maybe where they come from. So while this is kind of a review for us, I also think it's a really helpful explanation that we can provide to caregivers and can really serve as an engagement tool. So what happens after a trauma? I think we're all probably pretty familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response, right? So it's our body's alarm system tells us what to do when we, meet that bear in the woods. And so after a trauma for children, the way I like to think about it is this alarm system is a little broken. It can go off at seemingly innocuous times, right? So even though there's no danger, maybe someone raised their voice or they were bumped into in school, or it can be anything from someone, a certain smell or eating a certain flavor of ice cream, right? There's a lot of these triggers that can really be unknown. And so even though the danger is not there, those children who are in that fight, flight, freeze response after a trauma are really activated, right? And so even though that bump on the playground was nothing, maybe they get into a fight. This child alarm system is really kicked into survival mode. And I think this is a really important concept to help start us off when we're thinking about some of the difficult behaviors that we're talking about, the tantrums, the emotional shutting down, the overactive behaviors or the underactive behaviors, right? We want to remember that the behaviors that we're seeing are not necessarily intentional, that they might be a result of this child's broken alarm system, and they're just trying to keep themselves safe. Right. And so I think when we switch this mindset, that's where we can really start to become trauma informed and help caregivers understand, hey, this, not all of it, but this is where some of these behaviors might be coming from. This is why. And having this mindset can really help build that empathy. Some folks in that registration form also mentioned that caregivers might have their own trauma, and that can be really challenging when we're working with families. So I think this is also really important for caregivers to understand too, if they have their own trauma. What are my triggers? When can I notice that I'm in that fight, flight, freeze? And so again, this can be helpful for caregivers and also helpful for the kids. Okay, so we know that kids who've experienced trauma might be having these behavioral reactions because they're triggered. That's kind of one reason why we might be seeing some of these big behaviors. It could also be other things. It could be because they want attention, or it could be because they are trying to get out of something they don't want to do. All normal reasons why kids, act out. Um, but there are some clues that can tell us that a child might be stuck in that fight, flight, freeze response, and that we might want to respond in this trauma-informed way. So some of these clues are the emotions are really extreme. So typically caregivers will say, we're just walking down the street and then all of a sudden this big behavior happened and I really have no idea where it came from. So that behavior also kind of feels like it's out of the blue. These responses, these behaviors, whether they're the overactive behaviors or the underactive behaviors like withdrawal and things like that. We see a really big response to really minor issues and it happens really quickly. A lot of times caregivers will say to me, it feels like, my kiddo's going from 0 to 60. When these behaviors are happening, it can be really hard for that child to calm down on their own, even though those caregivers or others, teachers are trying to calm them down. It's kind of like they're inconsolable. So they're not really responding to that logic and reasoning. And that distress can really last a long time. Oftentimes, if it is that trauma response, kids are kind of feeling that they're out of control. And so there can be a little bit of heavy feelings around that after. And so sometimes kids can be apologetic or tearful and kind of sad about their behaviors later. I will say it is very hard to tell if a child is in fight, flight, freeze. Because trauma is so unique and trauma triggers there can be so many of them, they can really be endless. It is difficult to tell, but these are just some clues that we can help parents and caregivers start to notice. If this is what you're seeing, it might be because this is a trauma response. Okay, So just kind of a little bit of introduction again around where some of these behaviors for children that have been exposed to trauma might come from. I'd like to spend a lot of time in our time together talking about working with caregivers. Again, a lot of you all said in your registration survey that this is kind of the hardest area when I'm working with kids, and I agree as well. And so in the chat, if you could, I'd love to hear a little bit about what are some of the challenges you experience in working with caregivers around difficult behaviors. What are some of the hardest parts that you find in working with caregivers when you're trying to help them and support them in dealing with behaviors of their kiddos? And feel free to put that in the chat. Lack of participation and follow through, absolutely. Sometimes caregivers come in and like, okay, here's my kiddo. Can you do something about this behavior? Which can be difficult, absolutely. They really want compliance. So they're kind of like demanding compliance. So maybe their expectation of how kids are developmentally and where they are at isn't really in line or in match with their expectations. Caregiver burnout, absolutely. So they're just frustrated. They're tired. They're experiencing trauma as well. Maybe they feel lonely. Absolutely. So maybe they feel like they don't have the strength or the energy to really deal with these behaviors at this time. You hear a lot of that. Um, they might take the behaviors personally. So this kid is out to get me, and that's how it feels for them. Absolutely. These are all definitely things that I hear in my work and I hear in working with caregivers. Um, a lack of knowledge and understanding of child development and trauma and challenging behaviors. So there's that knowledge gap there. The behaviors are reoccurring and they're just really frustrated. Absolutely. They're dealing with their own unresolved trauma. Great. Keep them coming. But these are really common challenges that I think we all face in really trying to align and work with caregivers. Okay, so where do we begin then? I'm gonna start talking a little bit about assessment. Then we'll start to talk about all those engagement strategies that I think will really be helpful for all the things you guys are talking about in the chat. I do believe that starting with assessment, just kind of a brief assessment of what's going on, is actually a really good engagement strategy. Oftentimes, caregivers don't feel heard. And so I think starting with really understanding what is going on can be really helpful. Okay, so we're going to go over one assessment strategy. There's lots we can do, but this is kind of one of my favorites. And again, like I mentioned, I think it's a really nice engagement strategy too. So the slide is a bit heavy, but if we can focus on the three buckets at the top, we have the behavior, so what's actually going on, the antecedents, which is just a fancy word for what comes before the behavior, and then the consequences, which is a word for just what comes after the behavior. So the first time I meet with a caregiver and they come in and they're like, my kid is off the wall, they're acting crazy, they're out of control, I'm at my wit's end. I like to start with, okay, so we're in the behavior part. Can you paint me a picture? What does this look like? Because for me as a helping professional, crazy isn't very helpful. I'm not really sure where to go with that. So tell me exactly what this behavior looks like. Can you paint me a picture of what it looks like for you? Okay, so my kiddo is taking toys from their brother's room and they're hiding them all the time. Okay, that's one of the many behaviors that they're struggling with. And I really want to learn all about it. When is it happening? Is it happening during nighttime? Is it happening before bed? Okay, then I learn maybe that they're usually with their other kid when they put them to bed. There's a lot that we need to kind of learn about the behavior so we know how to respond to it, right? There's kind of a lot to explore in this first section about what that behavior is. Maybe it's attention seeking. And so really spending time on just understanding what those behaviors are. Moving to like that antecedent or what comes before the behavior. Let's say the behavior is a kid is cursing and really being mean to other kids at the bus stop. That's what you're being presented with. What we want to know is what's happening before that behavior. So thank you so much for explaining the behavior to me in detail. Just want to ask, what's happening before that behavior happens? They might not know, but hopefully they do. Have there been any major changes happening in your home and your family? Right? I know I worked with a kiddo around this, and it turned out that as I was kind of asking these questions, the parents had just gone through a divorce, and dad used to take him to school, but now he has to take the bus. And so we're seeing all these like behaviors at the bus stop. So really understanding what's going on in that family, what was going on before the behaviors happened can be really helpful because now I know I'm going to deal with this behavior a little bit differently. And then lastly, focusing on those consequences. So what happens after the behavior? Um, so as an example, a parent comes to you and says, my kid's really interrupting at school. I'm getting a really bad report from the teacher. They're even throwing things at other kids. What's going on? Well, I'd like to know, hey, what happens after that? So you get a call from the school. What happens? You hear that your kiddo's in trouble. Tell me what happens next. Well, I pick him up from school and I don't really have anywhere to go with him. So he comes to work with me, which he really enjoys. Okay, that's really helpful for me to know, right? So the things that happen after the behavior could be the things that are sustaining that behavior problem too. So it's helpful to take a bit of time in the beginning with caregivers. Again, explain to me all about this behavior. What does it look like? When's it happening? How often is it happening? What's happening before the behavior and what's happening after the behavior? And these kind of three simple questions can really paint a huge picture for me and help give me a direction of what strategy I want to use with this family. Okay. So thinking more about kind of caregiver engagement, how we align, how we connect with caregivers. I feel like this is a conversation. It could happen before the assessment, it could happen after, but I feel like it really does happen often. So a caregiver comes in and says, my child's really out of control. I'm at my wit's end. I can't take it anymore. I've tried everything and nothing works. They're just going to end up failing out of school and they're going to end up in juvie. So a lot of times these are the caregivers that we're meeting. Maybe they've tried stuff in the past and it hasn't worked. Oftentimes, I think where we want to go as helping professionals is to immediately jump in and say, it's going to be okay, everything's going to be fine. And I understand that desire, but what happens is that's not really validating for them. And oftentimes caregivers kind of don't feel heard if we jump right there. We might want to jump into problem solving. So, okay, have you tried timeout? Have you tried this? Also, not very engaging for caregivers, right? They might not feel heard. We might want to provide psychoeducation. Okay, let me teach you all about these things. Again, I think we're jumping a little too far ahead. I think the very, very first step that we have to take with caregivers so that they feel heard is creating space for them to share those concerns. I've made this mistake a bunch of times where caregivers will come in and share all about the behaviors and tell me everything, and I jump right to problem solving. And I'm sharing this, this, and this, and they're like, that's not going to work. This is not going to work. And I realized they're not feeling heard. I didn't leave time for them to create that space to share their concerns and really, share those unpopular beliefs. So I think we need to hear as helping professionals some of those unpopular or inappropriate thoughts, right? Like I'm at the end, my wit's end with this kid. Like we don't have a good relationship. I'm really struggling. I think we need to spend time in the beginning with caregivers to let them share this information. We want to align with caregivers and really have that empathy for them. In all the things that you guys were describing in the chat, sometimes it can be hard for us to align with that caregiver. Just get on board with this. You're not trying enough. You have to try these things. And so checking in with our own mindset of how we're feeling about the caregivers that we're working with, taking those deep breaths before those sessions, taking those deep breaths before we meet with caregivers, and trying to find that piece of empathy that feels genuine so that we can really connect. And then I think what's really important too is communicating a message of hope. Again, I often share with caregivers that kids who experience trauma, these are learned behaviors. They learned ways to keep themselves safe, right? They were in this situation that was uncontrollable. They figured out how to keep themselves safe. They're highly controlling, right? They want to control the environment around them because when they didn't control that environment, they got hurt. Right? So explaining that to caregivers, knowing that these are learned behaviors means that they can be unlearned too. We just have to shape them and replace them in some way. Okay. So one of the, I think, really helpful strategies around shaping some behavior is providing that psychoeducation, providing educational information about what's going on. I think, and part of providing that psychoeducation is asking, clarifying, and exploring. So asking caregivers, instead of just jumping in and providing the information, stepping back and saying, would it be okay or would it be all right if I told you some things that have worked for other families? Right. So these are kind of working with the caregivers that might be a little resistant, a little defiant. Clarifying for them, is there any information that would be most helpful right now for you? And exploring what they already know. What skills have you already learned? Tell me what you've already done in the past. What's been helpful? What hasn't been helpful? I see something in the chat. So, as a health and human service professional, once empathy is established and getting them to equate hope with further and future support is sometimes tough if their relationship with trusting new people or resources is questionable. Absolutely. We often see and we often know that working with kids who've experienced trauma, that can really be intergenerational. And the parents that we're working with have experienced their own trauma. So just how we know that trust is really hard for kids who've experienced trauma, it's also hard for adults. Um, that's why this part of our work is so important. And I think it often gets skipped in our haste to really want to fix and solve what caregivers are bringing us. I definitely had that inclination of like, oh my God, you're bringing me a problem. I have an answer. Like, let me give it to you. But it's really important to spend this time really listening, really hearing out. I really want to know what this has been like for you as a parent. I want to know the impact that these behaviors have had on you. I want to know all about what you've done in the past, what you've tried, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful. And then I want to hear what you want to know from me. So, really trying to have them guide this part of the process can be really helpful and can kind of slowly build that trust over time. So, I really appreciate that comment. Okay, so I kind of went quickly through that part, but hopefully I've emphasized again, taking that space, taking that time to work with caregivers, taking our own time as professionals. If we're feeling that gut instinct of like, oh my God, I have to see this caregiver again, it can be really helpful to figure out, okay, what parts or what pieces can I really align with this caregiver so show up genuinely and they can feel that trust from me. Taking all this time in the beginning to learn about the behavior in detail, ask questions, have them have space to talk is really essential before we kind of jump into strategies. But since we only have an hour and a half together, I'm going to go move forward and jump into some strategies for shaping some behavior. Okay, so I've organized the strategies around these kind of 4 different buckets here. Because after trauma, what we see is that kids really struggle with certain areas of child development. And they really struggle with these kind of 4 areas. What we know about trauma is that it really does interrupt that development in some way, and kids can kind of get stuck. Because of this, we see that these behaviors that come out and these behaviors that can be hard to manage. So we'll go over in each of these buckets what a disruption in this area of development can look like, and then what associated tools can we offer. All right, let's start with attachment. Of course, I can do a whole other webinar on that, but we'll just have a couple of slides here. So children are hardwired to attach. However, attachment just doesn't happen. Kids really need to receive a range of emotional support from those caregivers around them to really develop that secure attachment style. And so when that core support, like safety and security, isn't there, it can be challenging for those kids to develop that sense of attachment, right? So for kids who've experienced trauma, their sense of attachment or their relationship with others is definitely going to be impacted. And I know that's something that you guys were writing about and that we all see. So we have this example here. You're working with a family, you're working with a caregiver, and you're hearing or you're noticing that the relationship is really strained. There's a lot of yelling between the kids and the parents. You hear a lot of no, stop, don't do that. Child's pretty defiant, just not listening. Maybe caregiver even seems unempathetic, like, I've told you a million times, like, we're not doing that. And so think of this kind of family, and then we'll talk about some of the strategies that we can use here. If this is your presentation, if this is what you're seeing in the families you're working with, this is 100% where we have to begin. There is a ton of literature out there that shows no matter how excellent our discipline strategies can be, if there is not a good relationship between that child and that caregiver, no matter what we say, it's going to be unsuccessful. For me, and I think for others, it's kind of hard as a helper to want to start here on the relationship. A parent's coming in with pretty extreme behaviors, and we're like, let's work on your relationship. That maybe doesn't feel like it's meeting them where they're at. And so I think it's very helpful for us to really own this and communicate to caregivers why this is so important to start here. Okay. I think this cycle is a helpful way to reiterate that point to caregivers, why it's so important to start with building a relationship before I offer additional strategies to shape some of the really challenging behaviors that you're bringing to me. Okay. I'm going to try and make this bigger for myself. So I'm just going to go through this cycle. And this cycle is something that we often see. And I oftentimes go through this cycle with caregivers to help them understand. So a parent gives, like, let's say a command, hey, pick up your toys. No, maybe in 5 minutes, I don't want to pick up my toys now. So child refuses. Pair begins to increase. I'm not doing this every time with you. I said, pick up your toys. We've gone through this a million times. I don't want to hear it. Like I said, pick up your toys, pick up your toys. Okay. No, it's not fair. You said I can watch TV for 5 more minutes. And what if I just pick up my toys later? Right. And it keeps going. Then the caregiver escalates, child escalates. And it just keeps going in this cycle, right? Until finally the caregiver is either like, I don't care about these toys anymore. Do whatever you want to do. Or the child is crying, the caregiver is angry. And finally, after like 10 minutes, the child picks up their toys. Either way, it's kind of a lose-lose situation, right? So when I talk about with caregivers, if this cycle is happening for you, if we're honest, you're going to be the only one that can break it. Your kiddo, ages 6 to 12, is not going to be the one that breaks the cycle, right? And so here are some strategies that you can employ to help break the cycle. Okay, so the first one is what I call catch kids being good. Again, these are ways to increase that positive relationship between the caregiver and the kiddo. And again, a really important first step. So what does this mean? I think what happens when parents are really stressed out, kids acting out a lot, you hear a lot of like don'ts, no, you hear that cycle kind of happening. And so what we want to do is we want to talk to caregivers about balancing this out. We really want to balance out those negatives with those positives. So if they're identifying with this and this sounds like them, that's okay. Totally normal to get to this point, totally understandable. Now, let's try and balance that out at least. Let's try and add a lot of positives into your communication with your kiddo. So I call that, and we call that catch them being good, or you might have heard of it as labeled praise. So with caregivers, I have them think of the behavior that they're struggling with the most, the one that really gets under their skin. Sometimes I say, okay, if you had a magic wand and you can get rid of one behavior that's really bothering you, what would that be? So we can really focus it. And then think of the opposite of that behavior and praise, praise, praise whenever that kiddo does the opposite. So if we're working with a family where the child's really impulsive and they're just grabbing things all the time, every time that child waits patiently, it's a party. Wow, I love how patient you're being. So really trying to catch them being good. I think this is particularly useful with the kids that we're talking about in the school age population. It gets a little bit different when we're talking about adolescents. But again, kids 6 to 12, this can be really helpful. When working with families, I also find it really helpful if there's a sibling in the house. So instead of saying something like, stop that, which we always do, we can say something like, wow, like Sarah's sitting so nicely at the table. Like, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Sarah. And then the sibling wants to get that praise too. And so then they sit nicely at the table. Of course, this kind of sounds artificial. I think I always talk about with caregivers finding their own voice in this. I'll give them some examples and I'll share some on the next slide of what caregivers can say. But as always, if it's not genuine, kids will smell that out. So trying to find a genuine praise that feels right for that caregivers. So here are some, actually, I'm going to go back. I think I missed something here. So catching them being good or using that labeled praise, it increases the behavior that we want to see. It can help increase that kiddo self-esteem. And it's more effective than saying just like, good job, thanks for doing that, right? We want to say, thanks for picking up your toys. I really love how you're following through on what I have to say, or, something a little bit more natural. Here are some examples that I can use with caregivers. So if we're seeing some of that oppositional behavior you guys were talking about or that anger, here are some things that we might want to praise. So you're doing really well at being patient, or I'm so proud of you for using your words. I'm proud of you for cooperating. Nice job using your indoor voice to tell me that, right? And again, we're trying to catch that behavior. We might not see a lot of it, and that's okay. Anytime it happens, the first thing I say in my caregiver visits is, okay, I've got homework for you. Until you see me next week, here's what I want you to practice. I want you to try and catch this one behavior. And every time you see it, I want you to praise it, praise it, praise it. If they're hyperactive, if they're destructive, that's awesome. Thanks for waiting so politely. That's a good indoor quiet voice, etc. I see in the chat that this is what we teach in Triple P. Absolutely. I will say I've probably taught every behavioral parenting course out there. They're wonderful, and they're all very similar. So Incredible Years, Triple P, all of those like behavioral parenting strategies is where I'm pulling these kind of core strategies to shape behavior because we find them to be very effective. So I appreciate that. This is something you can give out to parents or something you can talk through parents within in your time with them. Again, this might feel natural for some caregivers. It might feel very unnatural for others. So like we want to shape any behavior. We want to give them a clear direction. For homework, I'd like for you to try this 3 times this week. Tell me how it goes. For caregivers that might be kind of skeptical around this. Okay, another strategy for shaping that behavior, for increasing that positive relationship with kids and caregivers is special time. So again, focusing on this relationship is really key. I think special time is really only for the school age population. We can talk a little bit about it. Looks a little bit different for kids, for adolescents, but for school age kids, I think this can be really helpful. It does help open up that communication between parents and kids. So special time happens a few days a week, 5 minutes a day. If caregivers can do it longer, that's great, but we know they're so pressed for time. What I have them do is I have them choose several toys that the child can then choose to play with. And we want to have these toys or activities be something that can build conversation. So it can't be watching TV or reading a book because obviously there's not a lot of talking going on. So we want to choose activities that don't encourage aggression and that maybe don't have a lot of rules and can be just a nice time for caregivers to connect with their kids. Again, if that behavior is really stressed and strained, this can be a really important kind of moment for just kind of some structured, nice, fun time. Again, this is definitely part of parent-child interaction therapy, part of all of the evidence-based treatments around helping kids with challenging behaviors. So again, this is part of that like antecedent control. When I mentioned that before, what do we do? One of my families that I work with said, I get under the behavior. And so I was like, that's great. So what do we do to try and get ahead of the difficult behavior? This can be one of those things. Again, time for a parent to be fully, totally, completely present. That is hard to happen in a really hectic day. And again, it's not just going to spontaneously happen. So we say, here's a homework assignment for you for 5 minutes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, or whatever days work for you. Let's try and spend 5 minutes doing this art activity. Where are we going to do it? What are we going to use to do it? And then report back to me and tell me how it went. Okay, so those are just a couple of strategies. There's, of course, a lot more. You can get creative with your caregivers. Tell me what's worked for you in the past. But just having an honest, open conversation about the relationship between them and their kiddo is definitely going to be a first place to start if that relationship is not strong. Because everything else we're going to offer is not going to work unless that's there. So trying special time, trying praise, trying just to other strategies to really build that relationship is going to be really important. Okay, so shifting to this second area of development of this like self-regulation. If you're seeing this when you're working with a family, you're noticing that that kiddo is really unable to calm down once upset. They can't reset after getting upset. When they hear no, they don't really do very well. They struggle whenever there's a change in routine. And if you make them wait for something, that's really hard for them too. So again, this can sound a lot like kids who have ADHD, which all these strategies can be very helpful for as well. Sometimes we also see this after kids have a trauma. So again, that's part of some education. After a trauma, these behaviors can look very similar to disruptive behaviors. Sometimes kids can have both, but sometimes those disruptive behaviors can really be masked as trauma symptoms. So when a caregiver describes this to you, providing some strategies around emotion regulation can really be helpful. Just to kind of ground us in what we mean by that, regulation is this result of being able to know how I'm feeling and then adjusting that feeling, which is hard for adults and hard for kids. So what can we do about this? I think one really effective strategy is modeling calm. Again, I think this is incredibly helpful when we're talking about kids who have trauma. So when caregivers reflect and model calmness, that is something that child will gradually internalize. Also something that they might not have received or might not have been in an environment around when they were experiencing that trauma. So that modeling is going to be incredibly important and helpful. So that first step is to really create the sense of safety. And this is something I practice and kind of role play with caregivers when I'm working with them. So when you notice your kid is in fight, flight, freeze, or they're just screaming and they're angry and they're at a 10, this is what I would do. Not a time for logic. So I would start with stand a few feet away and just speak in a calm voice and maybe speak in a quiet voice. Try and reflect back what you're seeing. I can see you're feeling really upset. Maybe that's all you say. And then you can offer to do a coping skill together. Sometimes that does not work. So do you want to try your belly breaths that we learned or model that? I'm going to need to take a belly breath right now. And just allow time for that child to calm down, back away, and really try and remain quiet. And that can be really hard for families. It can be really hard for caregivers to see their child in distress and not want to intervene. Or to not get upset if this is something that happens often, right? But when we see these kids in these huge behaviors, potentially in this fight, flight, freeze, this is what's going to be the most helpful. Then later, after that child calmed down, we can come back and say, hey, that seemed like it was a really, we're having a lot of feelings there. How you doing? Maybe having them come up with a coping skill that they can do could be helpful. Maybe we can take some breaths together. What happens if we're in fight, flight, freeze, and someone comes up to us and we start talking a lot to them and start offering strategies or start, having logic with them? Hey, that wasn't even so bad. Nothing really happened. Like, why are you reacting this way? Our thinking cap is kind of off, and our prefrontal cortex that we need to engage in this conversation with you is not really working. And so this is really just a time for calmness. Okay, another strategy that we can use that helps with that calmness and helps bring that calm, and helps with that self-regulation is using your emotional thermometer, which if you work with kids and families, you probably have some version of this. Kids with trauma, again, can go from 0 to 5. So I think this is a helpful practice. Just helping them to identify what it feels like. Having that family have a rating scale, I find to be such a useful tool. So doing this at a time when the family's calm, 0 to 5 is usually helpful for kids 6 to 12. What does it look like when we're at a 1, when we're really calm? What does it look like when we're at a 3? So maybe that's I'm starting to whine, I'm starting to groan. And what does it look like when I'm at a 5? I'm yelling, I'm kicking. Working with the kiddos around this can be helpful so they can see what that's like. And this can be a good family activity as well. The goal of this is to try and catch those behaviors when we're at a 3, because all of these strategies are going to be a lot more helpful than when we're at a 5. I think we know as adults, when we're at a 5, it's too late, kind of, we just need to take some time. And so working through with kids and families what each of these behaviors looks like so we can try and catch them and then implement some strategies when we're at a 3. I see in the chat here, I've guided parents with using a whisper voice before initiating co-regulation skills with their child. Sometimes that distraction is enough to pause the child. Absolutely. So using our whisper voice, using a calm voice, we might need to practice that with caregivers because it might not feel like the reaction to use. But even that whisper, like Rachel is saying, can like pause and shift that child and bring that child down. Again, if that kiddo is really just getting dysregulated, you modeling that calm, modeling that whisper voice can help bring that kiddo down. So that's a great point. Thank you so much. There's also another point, Rachel, you bring up here, which over time, the approach is natural. And that's really important, I think, when working with caregivers, being honest about like, this might feel really weird, or this might not feel like you, or this might feel different from what you've done before. And I get that it can be awkward. Over time, though, what we find when I work with parents is that if we practice it enough, it can start to really feel natural, and it doesn't feel like something you have to do. It just feels like a natural way of responding, which is the ultimate goal. So these are some popular relaxation apps that can be helpful. Again, we're talking about school age kids, but lately everyone has a phone these days. This is something that parents can have on their phone. This is something that I might have when I'm working with a kid. I can bring out this app. Personally, I like the Stop, Breathe, and Think app. I think you might have to pay for that app now. I'm not sure. But for the majority, these are free. And it could be helpful for our like 12-year-olds to have like a calming app on their phone that they can use as a way to help calm down as well. Okay, so we're still in this bucket of emotion regulation. Another, I think, helpful strategy for regulation is routines and rituals. So creating a routine around activities that are tough. I can't tell you how often those activities are the morning and the nighttime. It feels like those times are really difficult for kids. Transitions are also really difficult. I think those three are typically like the heightened times. And again, when we can focus the behavior, when we can focus the time frame, we have a lot better chance of being successful around changing the behavior. So let's say there's a kiddo who the morning is just so tough for that family. They're just dragging everything out. They're like a sloth in the morning. Everything takes forever. They're never on time for school. The parent's really frustrated. This is where a lot of the fighting happens. We want to create a routine around morning time. And on the next slide, I'll share some examples of what those routines can look like. For kids with trauma, rituals are also very helpful. So we know, let's say we know there's a date coming up that's really difficult. It's a kind of a trigger time, or we know that there's a court coming up, or it's an anniversary of a loss. How can we create a ritual around that? How can we get under or ahead of that behavior before it happens? What can we do with that family to set up? Okay, we know we're going to see some big behaviors coming up. What can we do? And then lastly, we have some choice. Like I think with kids who've experienced trauma, one of my takeaway messages is overall what it is, it's a removal of control. So kids who have experienced a trauma, that is one of the biggest impacts to their lives, is that they just feel like they have no control over their feelings, no control over what's happened to them, no control over the world around them, and it's very disorienting. As you can imagine, if we feel like we have no control, we want to gain control as much as possible, which can look like some challenging behaviors. So providing choice and working with caregivers around providing choice is such an important tool. So, hey, we have to do this thing. Do we want to do it at 8 o'clock? Do we want to do it at 8:15? Or, hey, we have to go out. We have to like bring these things out. Do we want to bring this out first? Do we want to bring this out first? Just these small areas for choice can be really, really helpful. And there's a lot of examples that we can think about around providing just small choices to kids. So in terms of that routine, I really love creating routines and like these kind of routines with families. So tell me about the most challenging time of your day. Tell me what's challenging about it. And let's create kind of a routine where kiddo can maybe earn something for following that routine. So a routine can be like, and I like to work with caregivers on creating this jointly with kids as well. So for young kids, having visuals is really important. If you're really busy as a provider, Googling this, there's a ton of free kind of charts out there too that you can use. You can feel free to use this one. Um, and as you can see here, it really kind of breaks down that morning into concrete steps so we can check them off as we go. Kids love checking stuff off, so that can be really fun for them to begin with. And again, breaking that down, we start to move from the morning is just so difficult to, okay, we're really having a hard time with this specific thing. I like to create these with my families that I work with. We post them somewhere. I have the kiddo decide where would you like it posted? How would you like to check it off? Maybe we get a star. Maybe we use a check mark. Let the kiddo do that themselves after they complete each activity. It can really just help that day go. Okay, I think this is maybe the last one under regulation, but rewards are really important as well. So I love creating behavior charts with families. I know that they could maybe be controversial, or families will come to me and be like, I've used a behavior chart a million times, it doesn't work. I like to say, well, let's try one with me. I've got some like tips and tricks here that might make it more helpful. So again, caregiver comes in with the behavior, or if you as a helping provider are hearing that there's a million behaviors, I like that magic wand. Tell me the behavior that's bothering you the most, because we got to start somewhere. So for this behavior chart, I usually like to keep it small. I like to keep it to max 3 to 4. Sometimes we see these behavior charts that have like 7 behaviors on them, and it's just too much. So for this example, it's make bed before school, get dressed before 8 o'clock in the morning, and keep hands to yourself. One thing I like to do is include a behavior that's pretty easy for the kid. So for this example, this kid loved making their bed, so it wasn't really an issue, but I like including it because if we're only including behaviors that are really tough, the kids are not going to receive the rewards, right? They're not going to make it, and then this is going to flunk. So we want to include stuff on here that kid can do, so they can circle that yes and feel really good about this. We want them to earn those rewards. We want this behavior chart to be really easy the first time we do it, so the kid earns that movie that they get to pick out, and then they're like, wow, this behavior chart's pretty cool. Like this, I get to earn things. If we make it really hard and they don't earn anything, then it kind of just doesn't work over time. So again, you want to think about with that caregiver, let's just add a couple of behaviors in the morning that are difficult, and then let's come up with some rewards that kiddo can earn. I really like coming up with a reward menu. Kids get bored really quickly. One week, a game is really fun, the next week it's not. So you want to come up with a menu of items that those kiddos can choose from, and there's many different ways you can create this. I find simple is best. So this is the example that I really like. Sometimes in session, I come up with the rewards together. So definitely coming up with the rewards with the kid is going to be really important. This is one for younger kids. The thing I really like about this example is, and the thing I find to be helpful with behavior charts, if you like to use them, is reminders. So just because I put on a piece of paper, respect people's things doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so I like to give reminders. So respect other people's things with 3 or fewer reminders. So that can look like, hey, Stacy, you just took that toy from your brother. That's 1. You have 2 more chances, so you can get your smiley face for the day. Okay, that's 2. You have 1 more chance so you can get your face for the day. It really helps kids earn the reward from this and then start to really buy into the behavior chart. So using reminders can be really helpful, especially with young kids. I like to give just some examples of rewards because we don't want the rewards to have to cost anything. So these can be kind of creative rewards that aren't too costly. So things like time with friends. Some kids really like to spend time alone, or time with your caregiver one-on-one if that's possible. Maybe having friends overnight, staying over a friend's house. Maybe they get a night off from their chores. They get time with parents. Maybe they get extra screen time, or maybe they get rent a video. So this is clearly very outdated. Maybe they get to, stream a video on Netflix or what have you. Again, these are rewards that we want it to be really incentivizing for that kiddo. So we want them to come up with it, and also we want it to be realistic. Okay, this is a strategy I also really think can be really effective for some of those like minor irritating behaviors. So you're working with a family and the caregiver is really frustrated and irritated because their kid's always like flopping around on the floor and rolling their eyes and trying to have the last word, right? So we can hear this a lot. These aren't necessarily the behaviors that you all mentioned in the beginning. It's not like the swearing or the aggression or those really like big behaviors, but these can be pretty irritating behaviors. This is when we might want to use this idea of active ignoring. So what is that? What behaviors do we want to ignore? Things like arguing back and forth, pouting and sulking, whining, crying, like please, 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 please. Those like kind of mild tantrums, mocking or mimicking, eye rolling, those kinds of things. These are behaviors that don't cause anyone harm, that aren't safety risks, that are just kind of annoying. So ignoring what kind of the strategy looks like and the way I talk about it with caregivers is it's when these behaviors happen, we want to ignore 100% of the time. So there's no consoling, there's no last minute warnings here, there's no nonverbals, we just remain calm and we just ignore. And it feels like for parents that we're not doing anything, but I tell them this is a very active activity. Ignoring is active. You're actually doing something when you're not doing anything. And it can be a really helpful strategy. If the behavior is for attention and we remove that attention, then it can be, then over time, the kid gets bored and the behavior goes away. So I'll kind of walk through kind of what this looks like or how I walk through it with caregivers. So for example, kiddo Benna is taunting her mom at the dinner table, always at the dinner table, trying to get attention by interrupting the family, making rude faces. Typically, we can start that cycle that happens of just escalation. Or in this case, mom lets kiddo know, hey, you can either let the kiddo know or not let the kiddo know. I find caregivers like to let their child know. I'm going to ignore. If you keep making those faces, I'm going to ignore you. And then mom starts ignoring. Maybe she gets up from the table, walks away. Sometimes you need that physical distance. You take like an I'm not listening pose. What happens is the behavior increases because this kiddo always gets attention when this happens. Keep ignoring, keep ignoring, keep ignoring. Eventually, it does get boring and it goes away. And that kiddo learns that I'm not really going to get attention for this behavior. So really the skill is about ignoring the behavior you don't want to see. As soon as that kiddo stops, hey, I'm so grateful that you're in your seat right now and that we can have a nice dinner together. Thank you so much. I love that. You pay attention to the behavior you don't want to see. So I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit about what concerns you think caregivers might have when they use this strategy. So especially when we're thinking about kids who've experienced trauma, what concerns might caregivers have about using active ignoring with kids who've experienced trauma? And you guys can throw that in the chat. Great. So child feels abandoned. They feel maybe they lost control. It can hurt their attachment. Ignoring may further traumatize the kids. 100%. I think these are really valid concerns that caregivers might have, that folks might have after a child has experienced a trauma. I really appreciate, if you can't tell, always talking about the concerns. Like, what are your concerns with this? Tell me what you're worried about in using the strategy. Tell me what is kind of rolling through your head about why this might not work. Being able to talk openly about these concerns is incredibly helpful for the likelihood of parents actually trying these out. Maybe a child might feel unwanted, it might escalate. These are great. We want the caregiver to bring these concerns up too. Tell me what concerns you have with this so we can talk through them. I think it's important, or what I like to tell caregivers to remember, is that you're not ignoring your child, you're ignoring those negative behaviors because you don't want your kiddo to be displaying these negative behaviors. I think a lot of parents feel more comfortable if they can let their child know they're ignoring them. And I find that to be totally okay. It's still an effective strategy. So you can say, hey, I'm going to ignore now. And for caregivers, that feels safer. Um, Especially after kids have a trauma, it might be helpful to share that too. So we want to hear these concerns from caregivers. And then we want to talk about that. Again, we're not ignoring that kiddo, we're ignoring the behavior, and we can let that child know that we're ignoring. We also want to be really open with parents around their fear of that it's going to escalate because it's a real fear and it might. So if you don't think you can ignore it, don't try it. Because if you do for a little bit and then you don't, what that kid learned is that instead of raising my behaviors to here, I have to raise them to here. That's what gets the attention. So be really honest. If you don't think you can ignore that eye rolling and you think you're gonna, then we'll use another strategy. But if there are behaviors you think you can ignore, then this can be really effective. Does ignoring work with teens? Yeah, I think it does. I think it depends. But again, if that behavior feels attention seeking, then if we remove that attention, the behavior does go away. So I do think it can be a helpful strategy. Again, I would never do this if that relationship isn't very strong and we haven't worked on some of those other connective activities first. But yes, I do. So it's a great question. So I'm afraid that they imitate me and ignore me when I'm giving instructions. That could happen. And sometimes it's hard not to laugh as well when we're doing this with kids too. It's okay. I tell caregivers, like, we're not going to be perfect at this. That might happen. I haven't heard of that happening very often. It's okay for caregivers to physically remove themselves as well. Turn their back if they have to, like, take a breath, take a moment, walk away, like physically show that they're ignoring. If a kid starts to copy them, they're just trying to get more attention then, right? So we want to ignore that as well. I would say that's a strategy, that's something you can use active ignoring for too. Okay. Again, with caregivers, I say this isn't going to fix everything. And I think being really honest about that, you're coming with a lot of challenging behaviors. There's a lot going on for your family. This is one strategy. We're going to learn a lot. We're going to try it a lot, but let's try this out and tell me how it goes. Always kind of be kind of like co-detectives with the caregivers you're working with. Okay, so we've gotten to timeout. I know this can sometimes be a somewhat controversial strategy. We can also call it time in. Sometimes that makes people feel a little bit better. I like teaching timeout with my families. These are for the behaviors that are really unacceptable to the family, or behaviors that are a safety risk. So for a lot of families, this means hitting. For some families, it means cursing, really learning about the family that you're working with and what's unacceptable to them. I try and keep time out to those behaviors that are really a safety risk. So destroying property, pushing over tables, things that kids might get hurt at. These are things that might require a timeout. Again, we're talking about school-age kids, not teens yet, or at least in this presentation. So again, here's an example. Caregiver comes to you and they're worried because their child's running into the street, right? That's a safety behavior. They're breaking things in the house, they're hitting their sister. I think this is where timeout can be effective. If you're working with a caregiver and they're like, this is not for our family, then that's fine, that's okay. But I do like to go over ways that I find timeout can be helpful. So I like to do a bunch of pre-work with my families before having them do timeout. I do think there's a bunch of pre-work, but I do think it's really worth it. So I talk about setting up timeout, which is really important. So what we want to do is we want to find a boring and unstimulating place in the house. We want to have that before we ever start timeout. So working with caregivers, where in the house do you think could work? Siblings are working there. Okay, not a good place. And that might be a real barrier and a challenge to find a decent spot where there's not a lot of people walking by or there's not a lot of stimulation. We want to determine how long the timeout is going to be. And I'll talk more about that. We want to explain the procedures to the kiddo before timeout. So I like to talk about timeout with my families. So this is what behaviors get a timeout, so it's not a surprise. Maybe we make a list, maybe we post it somewhere. I like to show the kiddos the timeout area in the house. If you do, hit your sister, or if you do one of these behaviors, here's what timeout's going to look like for you. Here's where the timeout area is in our house, and explain the rules of timeout. We'll go over those in a second. Making sure you as a caregiver are calm and in control. We don't want to be angry when giving timeout. So maybe we need to take our own deep breaths before we do it. And making sure we can follow through. So that can be really hard. And this can be really hard if you're not at home, if you're in a grocery store, what have you, but making sure that you can follow through. Otherwise, I wouldn't initiate a timeout. So Cynthia, I really appreciate your perspective here. I always get lots of comments around timeout. Sometimes I'm like, should we even go over it? But I really like it. Other folks don't suggest timeout. It kind of sounds like very punitive or like punishment. For some behaviors, I think that could be okay. Using words like time in and going over it with kids can feel a little bit safer. And it can feel a little bit punitive for folks. I really do only save it for those like safety behaviors. But again, my hope always is that we're working on all of the other things I suggested. We're working on building that relationship. Oftentimes that alone can help solve a lot of these problems. We're working on ignoring, we're working on getting ahead of the behavior before it happens, working on understanding trauma and modeling calm. All of these things I definitely encourage and will hopefully shape that behavior. However, if we're working with families where there are a lot of safety risks, I think that timeout could be something that's effective. So I help parents in my time with them. How do we initiate timeout? How do we start it? So Malik, you hit your sister, which is not keeping your hands to yourself. That's one of our rules. That's one of our timeout rules. So you now have a timeout. Or I also like giving warnings like we did with the behavior chart. So Sasha, that's one for not following directions, one more time, and you'll get a timeout. Again, I typically wouldn't do a timeout for following directions, but as an example, you can use reminders for this as well, and warnings. It doesn't have to be the first time they do it, unless it's a real safety risk. So just a little bit more about timeout. And again, you have these slides, but sometimes I like going over these with caregivers too. During timeout, it should be silent. We're not talking to the kiddo. You're removing that attention. We're not responding, and we're not really reinforcing anything that they're doing. So this is a good time to use that active ignoring. And a way to end timeout. This is not a good time to lecture. Feelings are probably pretty high. It's really just a time to use some praise after. So as soon as they get a timeout and they just go back to doing something, playing with a toy or going to their room or what have you, this is the time to start using that praise too. And really catch them being good, because we want to shift that energy after that timeout happened. So again, after timeout, not a time for reflecting and talking about what that behavior was. We definitely want to do that. We definitely want to talk about what that behavior was like, what timeout was like for that kiddo. But we want to give everyone time to be in a good space to do that. And we want to really use a lot of that praise after that timeout has been. So Emma, these are great questions. This is kind of where I'm getting to now. I'll pause here. So just Emma shared, does the timeout attention time have a relationship with how long per age? So like what's reasonable for a 6 to 7-year-old versus a 10-year-old? So they can have ample time to reflect. Great question. I think there's two parts here. I'm going to take it backwards. So the last thing you said and the first thing you said. So I think our hope is that in timeout, the kids will be sitting there and reflecting on, wow, I really shouldn't be hitting my sister because blah, 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 blah. I hope that happens. We hope that happens. In reality, I think a lot of times it's just a safe space for that child to that we're forcing them into, to calm down, to re-regulate, to move that fight, flight, freeze down, to take those breaths. to have just time away from an unsafe situation. So even if they haven't kind of reflected on those behaviors, I still think it's successful at stopping that unsafe behavior. And hopefully they're learning that, like, hey, timeout stinks. Like, I don't want to get in timeout. So I'm going to stop doing that behavior, right? And that's okay. I think that sometimes is enough. Even as adults, like, we do things because we don't want consequences. That's like a human thing. And I think that's okay for kids to have that rationalization too. And absolutely, I think the time of how long timeout is should definitely, or reset, we can use a reset. So yeah, the word timeout is very triggering. So we can call it whatever we want. And I think that's a great idea. So maybe we can start calling like it's time for a reset, or it's like it's time for you to have some time in, or whatever we want. We can even come up with that word, that name with the kiddo, and have that be something that we talk about when we're in a kind of a calm space. The time and timeout, how long? I think it depends where we're at. If we're home, if we're out in public, it's probably like 2 minutes. Anything longer than that is really hard for caregivers to follow through on. But if we're at home, I would say for kids, let's see, just scrolling back what you said here. For 6 to 7, I would say probably like 5 minutes, 10 to 12, maybe 7. But I really don't think it needs to be longer than that. I will say that these are some strategies that I think can be helpful when that child, which I hear is the most common kind of difficulty around employing this strategy, when they won't go, or working with the time. So I really like these kind of adaptations. So we can use for younger kids, like 5, 6, we can use guided compliance, or just like kind of guide them into the timeout space if they won't go. One thing that can be helpful is your reset time, or time in, or whatever we want to call it, doesn't start unless you're in your area. So that really helps kiddos get to their area. Sometimes for the younger kids, I have a, out of reach, I have like a little clock so they can see, kid-friendly clock so they can see how long that time is. Again, for kids with trauma who are in that fight, flight, freeze, or kids with ADHD who have a bit of that time blindness, having some visualization can be really helpful so they know how long they have to be there. Or we create a rule that you can earn time off of timeout. If this is kind of complicated, but it's really worked for some families. If you go to your time in or reset area and you sit there and you don't break any rules for like 3 minutes, you can get right out. So that can help sometimes kids serve that time in appropriately. Okay, so again, that is one strategy. If it's the only strategy being used, it's going to be very ineffective. It's going to cause a strain in the relationship. It definitely can't exist on its own. If you do use it more for those safety behaviors, and definitely employ parents to do all of the other strategies that we've talked about or that you know already prior to getting to this place. Okay. Just 2 more areas before we end today. I know there's a lot here. This second to last area, and I'll go quicker through these, is self-efficacy. So again, after a trauma, this is something we can see with kids. Gives up easily, avoid things that are difficult. They maybe appear really anxious. So we tend to talk about the big behaviors after a trauma, those external outward behaviors. But after a trauma, some kids turn inward and they withdraw and they become anxious and they give up easily. And one of those reasons is because their sense of self-efficacy might be reduced. So self-efficacy is this idea of that you have a belief in your abilities, and you have a belief that you can complete tasks and you can reach your goals and you can manage situations. We can imagine for kids with trauma, maybe they grew up in a home or an environment where that wasn't the case. And so this can kind of be diminished. So just briefly, ways that we can help to increase that sense of self-efficacy in kids. I've talked throughout this presentation about co-creating these strategies and these tools with kids. We want to be open and transparent. about why we're doing something. So we're using this behavior chart, or we're doing special time, why we want to do that, and including that kiddo in creating it so it means something to them and they feel like they're a part of it. That can be really powerful. Trying to create opportunities for success, so we can see that success. Fun tasks that kiddo enjoys, or maybe switching it up and asking for favors that are easy that that kid can complete. Really kind of setting up those environments for praise so that we can provide that praise. We want to notice and praise success, and we want to be honest and realistic too. If a kiddo fails, that's okay. Instead of kind of ignoring that, or kind of changing the narrative around that, I think it's helpful to say something like, that's okay, that must have been really hard. I can see you're disappointed. And just validating those kids' feelings. I think in all of this work, the more we can validate the way kids are feeling, rather than saying, no, no, you don't have to feel like that. It's okay. Wow, I see you're sad. I'm really sorry you're feeling this way. It's really hard. Can I help in any way? Or that must be disappointing. It really aligns with kids, and it helps validate those feelings, and it helps send that message that my feelings are okay. All feelings are okay. It's okay to have feelings, and we can tolerate feelings. Okay, and lastly, the last kind of area of development I wanted to talk really quickly about is social connectedness. Um, some this is from my experience, something I hear in working with families is they'll say, my kid's acting out. They were, any of the behaviors that we were mentioning before. And so I'm not letting them go to soccer practice, or I'm not letting them go to dance, or I'm not letting them do anything social. I would just really caution families around using social activities as a punishment, especially for kids that have experienced a trauma. I think what happens is we can take away all that social connectedness, which is really a time of building that positive self-esteem, increasing that dopamine for kids, raising their mood. And if we're taking away all of these social activities, we're really setting kids up for isolation. And in no way is isolation a helpful way for kids to heal or kids to be able to manage their behaviors. So just keeping in mind that social connectedness is really, really important, especially for kids after a trauma. And so I just caution folks in using this as a consequence, or at least as a first line of consequence for kids and families. Okay, so we've reached the end of me talking to myself in this one screen. I'm excited to ask some questions and hear a little bit from all of you. I did want to include some recommended readings here. I really like Russell Barkley and his work. It's really influenced me, and I think we see that in a lot of some of the other parenting programs. So I like Your Defiant Child. They also have Your Defiant Teen. Alan Kasdan also has really great work around behavioral parenting that I really enjoy. And then lastly, we have some resources on the ACTS project is the project that I direct here at Rady Children's Hospital. And we have some really nice resources on that website that you can feel free to check out around research and strategies around trauma in general, but also around parenting and effective behavioral interventions and other types of interventions as well. Okay, so thank you guys so much for being active participants in this, for being here on this Friday morning with me to talk about trauma and challenging behaviors. I really appreciate it. Dana, I'm not sure where you are, but I know we've got about a little bit of time left, so I thought maybe we could open it up for some questions if folks have any, and if not, we can just, I guess, end a little early.
We have one for sure in the Q&A, and I'm just going to take a quick look in the chat as well while you're looking at the question in the Q&A.
Great. So I see here it's from the question from Annabelle. So how do we recommend helping caregivers see personalized behaviors they could use active ignoring? Great. So I love this question. I think this is so important. A lot of times when I'm working with caregivers, they'll be like, this kid is out to get me. They're doing this because they know my buttons and they're pushing them. And it can feel really personal. It can feel like these behaviors are for me, they're geared at me. And then when I take them personally, like when we take anything personally, we become defensive and it's really hard to respond. And so taking time in that beginning when you're working with caregivers, one, I think providing psychoeducation around trauma and how these kids are in fight, flight, freeze moment, and how these behaviors are a safety strategy for them because it kept them safe when they were unsafe. And so now they're using them now, and we just have to kind of learn to replace them. That these behaviors aren't necessarily about you. They might need something from the behaviors, and that's okay. They're sharing what they need, but it's not necessarily personal. Taking time to discuss that and have that open conversation can help remove a barrier to caregivers actually using some of these strategies. So I think that's a really good question.
We've got another one from earlier in the chat.
Oh, great.
When you begin to notice generational trauma and some transference from parent unto child, how can someone new to the field begin to gain cultural competency?
Sorry, Jeannie, can you say that one more time?
Sure. When you begin to notice generational trauma and some
Mhm.
transference from parent unto child, how can someone new to the field begin to gain cultural competence?
That's such a great question. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. I unfortunately we didn't have there's only an hour and a half in this webinar, but we can do a whole other webinar on this question. So I do really appreciate it. I think it will happen. It is not uncommon for families that you're working with, where your focus is on the child, that caregiver has their own generational trauma. I think with any time you're working with families and we're talking about cultural competency, cultural humility, and cultural awareness, it's taking time again to ask those questions and create that space for that caregiver to share their experience. Sometimes we don't feel like we have time for that, although it can be really, really important. So tell me about the way that you were parented. Tell me about your history of parenting. Tell me how this aligns. I'm going to share this strategy with you. Tell me how this aligns with your experience, with your culture, with your community. Opening up space, I think, is our role as helping professionals, just to open up the question and then learn from our caregivers. So I think one way that we learn is from the people that we're working with, who are experts in their own culture and communities. And it's kind of our role to open up that space and listen. So I think those are really important conversations. Gosh, I wish I had resources off the top of my head. My first thought is like Caltrin will talk about this in some of their trainings. So they have really amazing trainings on cultural humility and cultural awareness and trauma. So maybe in a little bit, Dana can speak a little bit to those, but doing those trainings ourselves, I think, is really important too.
It's a good point, Melissa. We've got an array of trainings, particularly in the direct service portion of our website. In the archive, there are a number that are going to speak to this question. But you're right, it is an entire training unto itself. We have another question in the Q&A, Melissa, that deals with a specific situation
I
where
see. Yeah.
someone, you've seen it and kind of can speak
Mhm.
to how you might work with this situation.
Great. So just to share that situation, so I can try and answer it in like a minute, but obviously all of these specific case questions require quite a bit more time, but I really appreciate you sharing it. A kiddo in this situation, a kiddo is kind of, it sounds like getting angry and maybe acting out without even realizing that they're doing it. Maybe it's a bit dissociative, or maybe it's just like a routine, like I walk to school, I act out a little bit because it's like part of their, how they've always operated. Um, and so how can we deal with it when kids maybe aren't admitting that they're doing that? One thing is I would not want to get in a combative conversation around like fault and blame if that's not getting us anywhere. I'm just trying to think through this. I wonder if having discussion around it could be helpful. What does this kiddo think we should do when this happens? Do we add more time? Is there an additional consequence? I think maybe trying to have that conversation around, okay, so I sometimes it's hard to really notice when we're not following a rule, maybe making sure we have rules set up that we can point out. But if they're not noticing, maybe having those rules listed somewhere can be helpful, like again, in a visual format, so that after that behavior happens, we can go back to that and say, hey, this is what was happening for you. Um, it's a tough one. I think there's quite a bunch we could do. I think time is going to be helpful. As caregivers, modeling is such an important tool. Staying calm in those moments is really important. So taking those deep breaths, making sure that that kiddo is not in that heightened state. And then when we're both de-escalated, having a conversation around it can be helpful. I think that's a way to start. I think there's probably a lot more, but I'll pause for now just because we're running out of time.
Thanks, Melissa. Um, we have almost reached the end. I've got a couple of more comments, but before we move to these few next slides, I do really want to thank you, Melissa, for joining us today. Your expertise is always really welcome. I've listened to your live webinar a couple of times now, and I always find something new that's helpful. And so I imagine that there are others who feel the same. And to that end, if you could go to the next slide, I want to share one more resource.
Absolutely.
So we are super excited about this. If you are on this training today and you're thinking to yourself, I really would like to share this with the rest of my team, there are actually a couple of ways you can do that now. As I had mentioned up front, you'll have the recording and you'll have the slides and all the resources we talked about today in that follow-up email, and that'll be on our website. But in addition to that, we've actually taken and adapted this webinar into a self-paced course. And so I've dropped that link in the chat. You can go out and enroll in the course. It's free. You just need a Caltrain account. So you can create that. We have lots of other self-paced courses that we've started to develop. But this one will essentially walk through the exact same content that we saw today in a self-paced format. And once somebody completes the course, there is a certificate, unlike our replays where you watch them, but you can't get a certificate because you didn't attend the live training. In this case, if you complete the self-paced course, you can get a certificate. So this is a really great resource for your team. So that is my advertisement for an amazing new self-paced course based on Melissa's work with us. And I am going to also drop the survey for today, which again, if you would like a certificate of attendance, please leave us your thoughts in this survey. And at the end of that survey will be your certificate of attendance. And more importantly, we do read every single one of those and base the training that we schedule very strongly on your comments and what you need in terms of application in your work. So I thank all of you for joining us today. The survey is open. If you do leave the webinar and you have the survey open, it will remain open. And if you don't have a moment right now to complete it, it will be in that follow-up email as well. Thanks, everyone.